All right, good morning, brethren. Grace and peace to you this morning. Our text comes from the Song of Solomon in chapter 2, verses 3 through 7. I know I have the ESV translation up there, and I'm going to preach from the ESV translation, but I'm going to actually read from the King James just to sort of salvage some semblance of poetry. One of the great shortcomings, we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to translations and our opportunity to be able to read Scripture, unlike any other time in history. But one shortcoming is that when you translate from one language into the other, a letter or something, I think you can translate it and get the gist. But when it comes to poetry, there's so much lost. There's an Italian expression that's traditore, which sounds like the same two words, but essentially translates as translators, traitors. Right? In Italian, those two words are so similar, and that's often the case. So I'm going to read from the King James because it sounds more poetic, although it's nothing compared to what it would be in the Hebrew. So chapter 2, starting in verse 3. As the apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved among the sons. I sat down under his shadow with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. Stay with me, flagons. Comfort me with apples, for I am sick with love. His left hand is under my head, and his right hand doth embrace me. I charge you, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that ye stir not up, nor awake my love, till he please. One of the commonest complaints about Christianity in the modern world is that it is a religion of no, especially in regard to the sexual dimension of life. Meaning that while the rest of culture is moving in a progressively permissive direction, the church seems to represent a repressive, even puritanical negativity toward human sexuality. And this is especially true given that the prevailing narrative of our day is that to stifle another's sexual expression, regardless of the form it takes, is tantamount to denying his or her true identity. An act of intolerance which in the age of the triumph of the therapeutic, as we've discussed, is seen as the very worst kind of tyranny. Now, typically Christian apologists, those who defend the Christian faith, respond to this defeater belief, which would be something like, well, if I become a Christian, then I can no longer experience sexual intimacy. They respond to that by defending not just the sacredness of the sexual union, which is to say that God restricts expression of it to a particular context, but also its value, which concerns the benefits of adhering to those restrictions. This morning, what I want to do is to try to connect those two aspects, to attempt to demonstrate that the value of the sexual union is tied intimately to its sacredness, which is a counterintuitive claim in our culture, including within much of the church, because we tend to think of holiness and happiness as often being opposed to one another. That devout religious adherents as a group tend to be rather dour. Therefore, becoming a Christian to some extent means the forfeiture of all fun, at least until far into the future when we can enjoy the spoils of the afterlife, which unfortunately in the thinking of most Americans is a seemingly vacuous existence of harp playing and cloud surfing, the kind of kitsch you find the depictions of heaven on the Hallmark Channel and perhaps likely in hell itself. It reminded me of this Far Side cartoon that says, through some unfortunate celestial error, Ernie is sent to hog heaven. Right? That sort of ethereal kind of view of heaven is what most people think of it. But the truth is that holiness is the path to happiness. That is, Proverbs 15, 18 through 19 declares that great joy comes in the wife of your youth, and that you can forever be intoxicated by her love. meaning that true sexual delight is to be found not in some unrestricted exploration, but rather in its divinely ordained expression. In fact, the scriptures seem to suggest that the intimacy experience between man and wife is the closest thing that we have to the full glory of fellowship with the Almighty. The point being that our apologetic must do more than simply demonstrate that fornication and adultery and homosexuality and every other fallen expression of sexual desire is bad. It must also promote the goodness of the Adam and Eve paradigm presented in the opening chapters of Genesis, which means that it must demonstrate that the purpose of God's no is to point us to a yes. That God's no, in other words, is not just no for the sake of no, as I've said before, but rather no for the sake of yes. Indeed, the truth is that for every no, God provides us a forest full of yeses, as he does in the garden. Yeses that are meant to point us to our flourishing. My little girls at the moment are taking dance lessons, which could not be cuter. Having ballet and tap recitals in my house every evening is one of the great joys of my life. And I'm hoping I can just transition into grandkids doing it too. So just this sort of, I never move away from this, experiencing this because it's so great. In fact, in the plans for our new house, and maybe this is because I'm an older parent and this is embarrassing, but in the plans for our new house, we have a stage that we're going to build in their room for their spontaneous recitals and theater performances. And really, it's as much for our joy as it is for theirs. The point being is that, but let me say this, any dance instructor worth her salt will say no to her students way more often than she will say yes. Precisely because there are 1,000 ways to plie wrongly, but only one way to do it rightly. And there's always the one kid in the class that finds every way to do it wrongly, the more creative kid, I guess you'd say. But when the instructor says no, she is negating a series of wrong moves, trying to lead her students onto the narrow path of dancing well. And an accomplished ballerina will have heard thousands of no's in her development, many more no's than yeses. But eventually, all of those restrictions will lead her to being able to experience a greater freedom. The ability to genuinely move an audience with her performance. Similarly, I would suggest that the many no's that God says to imperfect forms of sexual behavior are of this type. They are not no's just for the sake of no, but no's that are to lead one to a yes. They are all aimed, in other words, at developing a proper expression of sexuality, to develop sexual virtue, a proper moral sense, and ultimately to the accomplishment of human freedom. Because that's what the law of liberty is all about. Conformity leading to liberty, as opposed to autonomy, which only leads to enslavement. And so the role of the church is not to kill your joy, but rather to ensure it, to guide you to its proper function and expression. This is what sacredness is all about. God setting aside the practices that will lead to your flourishing. And as we will mention in a moment, such sacred practices must be revered and protected because they are so easily neglected and forsaken. We are always and forever only one generation away from losing the sacred to devastating results, as Scripture testifies. And this is why, in the book of Deuteronomy, the Jews are admonished to teach the law diligently to their children, to speak of it when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. Because if we do not diligently preserve our institutions and traditions, then we will lose them. We might call this the moral law of entropy. In this fallen world, things naturally go from order to disorder, from peace to chaos. And the work of new creation is to fight against that process. Now, having said all of this, it's unfortunate that the church has not always understood the goodness of the one-flesh union, much less articulated it. Indeed, she has often viewed it with disdain, a privation which predominates much of church history, I'm afraid to report. Even from the very beginning, during what is often called the patristic period, which makes up the first 8 centuries of Christianity, most of the church fathers had a very paltry view of marital intimacy. Now, for us to understand why that is the case, we have to return, as is typical when trying to dissect features of Western culture, we have to return to 5th century BC Athens and to the teachings of Plato. For the ancient Greeks, denoting the virtue that we call rather meagerly love required a whole range of words. And that makes sense because it is a concept that is rich in meaning. But just as an example, there is the love of brotherly affection, the feeling of kinship and solidarity that emerges from a shared devotion and common values, of having the same mind and love and being in full accord, as Paul says in Philippians 2:2. The Greeks called this facet of love philia. You can think of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. But there is also the love of action, the way of being in the world that Paul so poetically portrays in 1 Corinthians 13, that love is patient and kind, that it does not envy or boast, that it rejoices not in wrongdoing but in truth, etc. The more excellent way, as Paul commends this love. And many have identified this embodied conception of love with the Greek word agape, which is the word that the apostle uses in this famous passage. And then there is Eros. Eros is the love of desire, the romantic kind of love expressed between a husband and a wife. However, and this might seem odd to you, but for both Plato and the patristics, the church fathers, Eros was also a love that characterized man's relationship to God. According to Plato, the good, whose metaphysical address is God, is not just revealed to man's intellect through reason, but it is also awakened in his affections through beauty. In other words, the truth is not just rational in Plato's view, it is beautiful. And it is the beauty of truth which draws man into an encounter with the divine. And it does so by stirring within him erotic desire, but not in the sexual sense. And I know I've already triggered you by using that word, but withhold your judgment for just a moment. The point is that the splendor of the good, or God, provides man with the allure, the momentum, or the gravitational pull towards himself, and draws man into fellowship with the divine life source. This is why, by the way, we associate beauty with the idea of attraction. We say, well, that person's very attractive. This is Plato's insight that we are drawn to that which is beautiful. And we see this kind of kindled desire expressed often in the Bible, particularly upon the lips of the Psalter, whose object of affection is God himself. Like Psalm 42, as a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. Or Psalm 63, verse 1, O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. And of course, we find it expressed again and again in the Song of Solomon. The shepherdess says to her beloved in chapter 3, On my bed by night I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. I will rise now and go about the city, in the streets and in the squares. I will seek him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. The watchmen found me as they went about in the city. Have you seen whom my soul loves? Scarcely had I passed them when I found him whom my soul loves. I held him and would not let go, until I had brought him into my mother's house and into the chamber of her who conceived me. Now, the allegorical reading of this text concerns the church as the betrothed bride of Christ, and it expresses the erotic love between Christ and his church. There's that word again. Its meaning transcends the sexual connotation, in other words, in its history. Now, one thing to notice about the love of Eros is that it is emotionally intense. It has that Romeo and Juliet kind of ferocity and instability. It descends upon the heart, says Roger Scruton, as an invading force, overwhelming the psyche. But it is also supposed to ascend like a fire and carry the subject heavenward to the realm of the forms, which is the kingdom of God. The physical beauty of the body of one's beloved, in other words, is meant to beckon him to ascend Jacob's ladder into the third heaven, not to trick him into plunging into the depths of carnal desires. And so for the Greeks, the physical represented that which is evil and that which is corrupt, while the spiritual was pure and it was divine. And therefore, urges to unite with the body physically must be resisted, or one will lose the transcendent. Eros must be lifted from the realm of mutual appetite and remade as a spiritual union, as one writer put it. And this is where we get the notion of Platonic love, the joining of two people not in a physical way, but in a spiritual way, the influence of which really exalted the notion of celibacy, as it marginalized the idea of marriage. And as a result of that influence, many Christian thinkers began to view the sexual union, indeed marriage itself, as a kind of second-class way of life, believing that marriage was for the weak, for those who lacked the character to overcome their carnal desires, and as a result, it was thought of as being less spiritual. And so you can see why, with the rise of the professional priestly class, this would also lead to a rise in celibacy, at least among the clergy. Excuse me. And also the creation of the sacred-secular divide between the holy priests, who were celibate, and the wanton laity, who were not. This was something that the Reformation's idea of the priesthood of all believers dismantled. Reformation Day is today, by the way. We celebrate over 500 years since it took place. But the animal appetites, including sexual desire, must be starved to death, it was thought, in order to obtain enlightenment. And that was the common thinking during the patristic church and afterwards. For example, the great Augustine of Hippo apparently hadn't come very far from his Manichaean Gnosticism when he said this soon after his conversion: "I know nothing which brings the manly mind down from the heights more than a woman's caresses, and that joining of bodies without which one cannot have a wife." Sexual intimacy in any context makes one spiritually dull, says Augustine. And Augustine's mentor was Ambrose, whose ascetic theology was heavily fermented with this matter-spirit dualism of the Greeks. He taught, for example, that intercourse in the Garden of Eden was non-existent, that it was only after the fall of Adam and Eve that they corrupted themselves through sexual intimacy, which would, of course, make it very difficult for them to fulfill the command to be fruitful and multiply, but whatever. Unfortunately, these negative views concerning marital intimacy came to dominate Western Christian thinking. And you may never have heard this before. It may seem strange to you, but it was what almost everyone believed for nearly 1,500 years. And so it's not really surprising then that our word erotic has been imputed with a sinful connotation, that it makes us cringe when we hear it, that it's the kind of word you don't utter from the pulpit. There's children present. The cringiness of the word is evidence of the influence of Neoplatonism upon the church, a prudishness which certainly did not characterize the author of the Song of Songs. Now, beginning in the 1960s, which is all I have to say, and you know where I'm going with this, but beginning in the 1960s, and perhaps culminating in the provocative preaching of megachurch pastor Mark Driscoll, things changed dramatically in certain conservative Christian fellowships. Many preachers, eager it seems to reach celebrity pastor status, took advantage of the church's prudishness by going to the opposite extreme. I mean, anytime you tear down a taboo, it's going to get people's attention, both inside and outside of the church. But again, we return to Chesterton's fence, right? You buy a field and you see a garden in it and it has a fence around it. You don't tear down the fence until you figure out what the fence is for. By the way, as you'll see in a moment, I think he got that from the Song of Solomon. But the hippies did not know what the sexual taboos were for, and so they foolishly tore them down. And perhaps in part that's because the church didn't bother to tell them why they had built them in the first place, right? All that was communicated to them was just don't tear them down. It was just a no for the sake of no. And so eventually they tore them down and are still to this day tearing them down. And the Song of Solomon became a favorite text whose highly figurative language was filtered through a modern-day pornographic lens, which provoked the austere Pastor John MacArthur to describe the depraved exegesis of this movement as a spiritual raping of the text. I mean, in one extreme example, there was a pastor and his wife put their bed on the top of the church building in this just sort of grotesque, outrageous kind of behavior. It became sort of this one-upmanship in the early 2010s. Who could do something more outrageous? Which again demonstrates that what we have in pulpits today are more P.T. Barnums than what we really need, which are Dietrich Bonhoeffers. But the mistake that's made by both the dualists, and dare we say the degenerates, was to direct sexual desire towards the beautiful body only, rather than towards the embodied subject. The solution to the potential dangers of erotic desire, in other words, is not to suppress the desire entirely or to indulge in it, but to make sure that it is aimed at the proper subject, that it retains its personal focus. Indeed, it seems to me that this is how Eros was corrupted by the fall. Post-lapsarian, after the fall, sexual desire was turned toward the body only. And as Roger Scruton describes it, he says that humans then fell in the fall into the world of objects. No longer subjects, they became objects. They became things that are to be used rather than persons to be adored. And really what we might say is that what is lost is the second kind of love, the agape kind, where agape no longer governs eros. That's what's different after the fall. Aquinas described agape as the willing of another's well-being. This is the neighborly kind of love. Who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? This idea that we are to desire another person's flourishing even if they are our enemy. Agape is to and must govern eros. It prevents it from going off the rails. And in the fall, we lose agape. And so the difference then between love and lust, between pure and impure sexual desire, between eros and porneia, which is the Greek word that the New Testament uses to denote unlawful sexual activity, is the difference between two kinds of interests. Interest in the embodied person themselves, on the one hand, and interest in the body only on the other. True human individuality, Scripture informs us, belongs to our embodiment. You know, we use the words agency and autonomy a lot. But what we really mean when we use those words is that man is more than just a material object. that he is more than just a body, that his actions and decisions are to be explained by appeals that go beyond biological functioning. Man is not just an animal. He's not just a physical organism, as the materialist claims, but he is an embodied soul. And what lust does is it destroys that individuality by focusing purely on the body. And thus, like a magic wand, it turns the human subject into a mere object. It turns it into something that is just to be consumed and used. It turns people into things, and thereby, as Scruton says, disenchants them, destroying the source of their true beauty, the image of God in them. And I find it ironic, I guess, for all those people who champion personal autonomy, those who are unbelievers, right? My body, my choice, right? And then they just turn around and engage in promiscuous behavior, right? Using other people for their sexual gratification. Those people are hypocrites in the profoundest sense of the word. They are not respecting the true freedom of other persons when they engage in that kind of behavior, even if the other person is a willing participant, because they are using them as a means to an end and not as an end in itself. And they do so under the guise either of, wanting to unite with them in a deeper and more spiritual way, or, promising more to them than they're willing to commit, or either by appealing to their base desires to get them to engage in this behavior. But they're just manipulating them into the world of objects, is all they're doing. You are manipulating that person into giving up their humanity, their subjectivity. And it seems to me that this isn't much different than rape. Rape drags the person into that world, right? And this is what makes rape so horrific. It's not just that it's unwanted contact, but rather it's an annihilation of the subject. That's why it's so devastating. It's one of the most effective ways of dehumanizing a person. And that's why it has often been used as a tool of dispiriting an enemy. But fornication does essentially the same thing if you think about it. It's only more socially acceptable. It just accomplishes that dehumanizing through manipulation rather than force. If you are really for personal autonomy, you would be against fornication, against sex outside of the lifelong commitment of marriage, because that's the only context in which the gift of yourself can be properly received and reciprocated, where Eros will be governed by agape. If you were really about personal autonomy, you would stop manipulating people into giving up their humanity. Unholy desire, then, is a denial of the subjectivity of humanity, a way of negating the moral demand that free beings must treat each other as ends in themselves. And thus, if my ultimate interest is sexual gratification, if that is my supreme good, then I will view bodies as objects and nothing more, as something to consume, not something to love and adore. But true romantic love, as expressed in the Song of Solomon, is an almost overwhelming desire to not just unite with the body of your beloved, but also their soul, to unite with that individual person, one for which there are no substitutes. It seeks a complete union with them, not just in flesh, but also in spirit, which is of maximum benefit to both of them. And this kind of co-yielding and co-giving is exactly what Paul teaches the brethren in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 7:4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. So many times when we talk about this passage, we focus on the authority word and not the yielding word. I think the emphasis is upon the yielding. Such mutual yielding is what leads to the greatest satisfaction in the marital union, indeed in any relationship. It's giving up a lesser freedom in order to receive a greater one, where two, right, is better than one. The two become one flesh. That's better than just the one flesh. And so if sex devolves into something less than this, less than the giving of each other as a gift, less than an expression of eros and agape, the scriptures resolutely and loudly say no to it. When sex becomes about taking and using, when it becomes selfish by nature, then it has become corrupted. Selfish sex is unholy sex. And so notice that the ultimate deterrent then to sexual immorality, in whatever form it takes, is agape. If you truly love the other person, if you truly value them as an end and not simply as a means, if you truly value their well-being, if you count them as more important than yourself, then you will not corrupt them just in order to have your sexual desires satisfied. Because your focus will be much more on giving than on receiving, right? It's better to give than to receive. We focus upon giving, and then we will receive so much more than if we focus on receiving. And the same is true in this relationship. We focus upon their flourishing rather than our momentary gratification. And the beauty is that if you're in a committed relationship, the other person is focusing the same way upon you. All of this informs us that the stirring of eros is very dangerous because it makes you vulnerable to being manipulated and abused. This is one of the reasons why this kind of intimacy is reserved for the marriage covenant, to be carried out in the context of a lifelong commitment. Not a quick yes in the moment, which is utterly insufficient for the risk you are about to take, for the loss that you might experience as a result. Because the danger is so great, it requires a fence around it. And many traditions have understood this. And those which haven't have suffered terribly as a result. And human trafficking and prostitution and on we go, this total confusion over genders and on we could go, are just manifestations of that fence being torn down, really starting in the 1960s. So let me say to people who are the single people we have, and the young people, right? But really to everyone, we're all in danger of this. But don't think for a second that sexual intimacy is a casual thing. It is not. It is freighted with spiritual and emotional peril. And I don't say that just to oversell this so I'll scare you so you won't do it. This is the truth, and human history testifies to it. And our culture cries out this truth in all the chaos that is going on. To engage in it outside of the covenant of marriage is risky business, and it will damage you. You will be used and abused by it, even if you don't see it at the time. And it will affect every future relationship you have. That's what happens when you get used by someone. You stop trusting people. And relationships are built upon trust, especially marriage. And that's why the bride in our text in chapter 2 warns her sisters repeatedly. In fact, this is a refrain of this song. It comes back again and again. Maybe it's the chorus, we might say, where she says, she warns them not to awaken love until it so desires. Be careful to only awaken the God of Eros, she says, when the time is right. For once he is kindled, he is hard to control. And the havoc he can wreak is immense. And thus he must be resisted until the moment is right. And intriguingly, in the latter part of chapter 2, the shepherdess compares waiting for marriage to guarding a vineyard. As I said, I think this is perhaps where Chesterton gets his notion of the fence. One writer paraphrases this section this way. In the springtime of the year, when flowers are in bloom, and all nature is telling you to go forth, be fruitful, and multiply, the woman warns us of the little foxes that can damage the fragile blossoms of the vineyard with serious long-term consequences for its fruitfulness. The bride here is warning her sisters of what happens if we harvest too early, which is that the long-term flourishing of the relationship will be damaged. She reminds us that the farmer who invests his energy in protecting the integrity of the vineyard will not regret it later, even though the benefits of this painful perseverance won't be reaped until the time is fully ripe. There is a season, in other words, for everything, and the time for expressing one's love for another through sexual intimacy is marriage. It is only then that such relations will reap their full reward, when Eros can be governed by agape. And so I return to my thesis. The purpose of the sermon was to try to demonstrate to some extent the value of the sexual union is intimately tied to its sacredness. In Scripture, this is not just God giving us a no for no's sake, right? This is not God as the cosmic buzzkill, but this is God warning us. He's directing us to the path that we must walk down, because there are many paths we could choose, and many of them lead to peril and to destruction. Choose the right path. What a blessing it is that God has shown it to us. Imagine what our life would be like if we were in the dark, groping around, and the only way to learn the lessons would be through loss. But we are blessed to have a Lord who has shown us the way.